Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. I lived in Missouri for much of my life. Teaching about religious diversity and religious practice in a Missouri high school made me appreciate the social beauty and complexity of my surroundings and get more out of living in Missouri. When I started this Classical Ideas project, I lived in Missouri and got to know quite a few scholars of religious studies departments around the state. Having grown up in St. Louis, I noticed a cool project called Arch City Religion pop up sometime in early 2018, which began adding information about the history and practices of diverse houses of worship around the St. Louis metro area. I noticed it was run by Dr. Rachel Lindsey from St. Louis University's Department of Theological Studies. We got in touch. I read her book, Communion of Shadows, Religion and Photography in 19th Century America, out from University of North Carolina Press, and we planned to chat together last summer. It didn't quite work out for scheduling reasons, but I'm delighted to finally have her on the show to discuss her book and religion in my childhood hometown. Dr. Rachel Lindsey is assistant professor in St. Louis University's Department of Theological Studies. She has a Ph.D. and M.A. in American Religion from Princeton University and a B.A. in Religious Studies from Missouri State University. She is the author of Communion of Shadows, Religion and Photography in 19th Century America from UNC Press. We discussed Communion of Shadows and her fantastic projects, Lived Religion in the Digital Age, which employs digital research to explore, map, and study religious diversity, as well as her project Arch City Religion, which documents valuable information for researchers, students, journalists, and the public, and also uses the rich history and culture of St. Louis to think through the craft of research to show the diverse religious landscape of St. Louis, Missouri. You can find Dr. Lindsey's projects at archcityreligion.org and religioninplace.org. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Rachel Lindsey. Dr. Rachel Lindsey from St. Louis University, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just spend a moment introducing yourself to the audience, maybe say what you do every day for a living in the world?
Absolutely. Well, I teach at St. Louis University in the Department of Theological Studies. My area of expertise, where I teach and write, is in the area of religion in American history, with a special focus on visual and material cultures of American religion. So my day-to-day is a lot of teaching about religion and politics and sort of the world around us.
How many courses do you teach in a given section at St. Louis University?
How many courses do I teach in a given how many students do I teach?
I mean, like per semester. Sorry, how many courses do you teach per semester at St. Louis University?
Well, it's varied. I started as a non-tenure track assistant professor, and I was teaching a 4-4 load. And on the tenure track, I'm teaching a 2-2 load. So.
Awesome. Cool. I was just curious. How did you get interested in the academics of religion, like academic religious studies? Did religion come first or did academics come first? How did that all come together for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In my life story, religion definitely came first. I was not very academically driven when I was, younger in high school. It was really when I got to college and was taking some religion classes around the time that religion sort of became a national topic of conversation in ways that I hadn't recognized it before. So I was a freshman in college in the fall of 2001 and taking a Bible class, actually, at what was then Southwest Missouri State University. And suddenly, for the first time, these conversations around Islam and Christianity and fundamentalism and terrorism were like tumbling into each other in ways that I didn't feel very well prepared to address on a personal level, even though I had been sort of raised in a very religious family where religion was just sort of assumed and it was something that was part of our lives. So the religion part of things came first. The academic interest definitely came later, but it's been what has sustained me for the last 20 years or so.
Nice. So we're going to discuss a lot about your book today, A Communion of Shadows, Religion and Photography in 19th Century America from University of North Carolina Press. And earlier you mentioned that you're really interested in the digital media aspects of religion, including photography. Can you tell me how you sort of found that area of specialty when you were in your doctoral program?
Right. No, absolutely. It's funny that I'm now becoming associated with digital technology, digital religion, as it were, because really I come to this from a different door, even a back door, I think from most folks who find themselves doing digital humanities. So my interest in the digital actually starts much earlier with my work on photography in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, photography was this new technological revolution, right? And people began to not only to use photographs, for instance, in their family lives and in their religious lives, as I argue in the book, but photography began to sort of shape how people were encountering the world. And I began to see sort of similar movements in the last 20 years when it comes to sort of digital technology, right? So whether we're talking about sort of the pastoral uses of digital technology or the academic or the theoretical, there's this sort of assumption, this interest in the revolutionary power of digital technology to really fundamentally change the world, right? And I hear in that sort of enthusiasm echoes of the folks that I studied who were saying similar things about the 19th century about photography and stereography in particular, but really all forms of photography. So my fascination with photography, to get back to your original question, is what has guided me through this whole sort of academic trajectory. And that interest actually began not with the digital, but with the materiality of photographs that I was finding in archives and even my grandmother's home. So in the preface to the book, I sort of talk about how it was the stereographs and the pictures on the wall and sort of the material history of photography that was part of my sort of family story really is the seed, I think, of my interest in photography and religion, and then later on sort of different technological developments that I hear as echoes to that earlier story.
When you realized this love of photography, did you start dabbling in photography yourself? Like, is this like a side passion for you as well?
It was, and in fact, when I was in high school, I took a bunch of photography classes. I even had a darkroom in my mom's friend's basement, where I would go and kind of retreat from the sort of chaos of adolescence, and I could find some kind of solace in the red glow of the darkroom.
I love that. Okay, so I am really intrigued by the mysterious title of your book, A Communion of Shadows. I just love that. Tell me about the importance of this mysterious phrase, which you use throughout the book. What does that mean?
I mean, it's interesting that you hear that as mysterious. I guess I wasn't really thinking in that register, but so there's this common phrase in Christian history, the communion of saints. It's an ancient idea, right, that goes back to the earliest formations of Christian community. And by the 19th century, this idea these debates around the communion table were becoming even more charged politically, socially. And so the idea of a communion of saints has long been part of stories of religion. And what I was sort of seeing and feeling and recognizing in photography is that it was sort of more than just this material history that I was interested in. It was the ways in which photographs were being used, as I call in the book, a traffic of objects, right, to mediate different peoples and different realms of existence, to use a pretty vague term, but to bring people not only into communion with each other, sort of as temporal contemporaries, but with the biblical past, and with, in the case of memorial and mourning photography, with those who had gone on, into the next phase, right?
Yeah.
So this sort of tethering of past and present and future is something that I see working out in photography and photographs in particular. And so the communion of shadows is intended to invoke that ancient Christian idea of a communion of saints, which also has sort of similar, like the mystical body, right? Sort of unites Christians. And so the communion of shadows is intended to sort of riff off of that, while also really drawing attention to the materiality of photography in the 19th century.
It's really beautiful. And you start the book by telling such an interesting story about a 22-year-old soldier named Walter Jones, who was photographed, then went off to war, and had his life saved by a pocket Bible that he had inside of his clothing. He was shot on 2 separate occasions at Appomattox and in Virginia, and the bullets lodged in the concealed Bible. And I just love these little things that scholars and historians are able to dig up in archives. And I love that you started the book with this story of this young man. Why did you start the book with Jones and his photograph?
It's another great question. So I started. First of all, I was just fascinated by this story, right? So there's this sort of literary trope in the 19th century about, Bibles, even further into the 20th century, about Bibles saving people from bullets, right? Like this is a motif. And so I was a little bit sort of suspicious when I first came across this photograph in the Library of Congress. And so I was just sort of starting out my research and trying to figure out, what does it mean to tell a story of photography and religion? What kinds of artifacts am I really going to be able to include in this archive? And I came across this image and was like, oh my gosh, this is really rich, but I don't really know what it means yet. So I did a little bit of digging, and so it turns out that there are all these layers in this initial photograph that I wasn't really able to see at first. And that's kind of why I wanted to start with this, because it was an opportunity to sort of excavate a particular picture in order to sort of shift our attention from this idea of photographs as being simply, or even primarily, I should say, records of a particular moment, and to think instead about photographs as being these sort of mediated objects, right? So what I'm trying to do in that introductory vignette there is to start not with the image that sort of we see today, but with this portrait of a soldier going off to war, right? And this is a very common motif. A lot of photographs from the 1860s sort of followed this template, and so there's a way of reading that photograph, and then you sort of fast forward to the late 1890s, when Jones himself is sort of reflecting on his life, and he's beginning to think, what is my story? What is my legacy? And he curates this sort of bigger picture where he has his sort of Civil War photograph, his enlistment photograph, sitting alongside the Bible and the bullets. And what I wanted to really draw attention to was that the photograph in this instance, in this context, is sort of presented as an object, right? It's not just a picture. It's an object that is, in many ways, doing the same work as the relics of the Bible and the bullet in this composition. And then when we add to that, when Jones sort of created this composite portrait or composite picture in the late 1890s, he titles it A Testament, right? So, I mean, there's a way in which we can infer that he's talking about the Bible, like the written text, the New Testament that he had held in his breast pocket. But I think this is also sort of telling the ways in which photography becomes a kind of New Testament to 19th century Americans. And so that's the different layers that are involved in this photograph, I think, help us to parse out the different ways of analyzing photography in the 19th century. And it's all wrapped up in a great story too, which is helpful.
Yeah. So, and in the introduction chapter, you write, and this is a quote, "Not unlike the communion of saints, the communion of shadows was a traffic in objects that at once bound communities into proximity with one another and generated boundaries of exclusion." How do people from the 1840s onward begin to incorporate photographs into their religious lives? Is this a conscious decision they're making, or does it just sort of happen accidentally over time?
I think both and, right? So there's some initial hesitation to use photographs in official religious context, right? And the evidence on that is pretty scant, but I think it was more this sort of, as we see with later technological innovations as well. It's sort of this moment of hesitation to see what exactly is this doing to our tradition, to our polity, and but I mean, so on the official level, there's some resistance, right? But on the popular level, I didn't find any evidence of that at all. So what I do in the book is I sort of rein myself in by focusing on 5 different kinds of photographs that people began to adopt into their religious lives, and that began to not only be adopted into their religious lives, but to shape how religion was practiced and experienced from different perspectives. So I look at portrait photography. Americans are very, very quick to adopt this new way of representing themselves and each other, for both good and for sort of nefarious purposes. We can be quite honest with that. And then in that chapter, I'm looking at how this sort of sudden boom in portraiture in the 1840s, 1850s, and the Daguerrean period is sort of the backstory to this new practice in Bible publication in the 1860s of including portrait galleries in those massive family Bibles. So I'm doing a little bit of an excavation of that particular archive with portrait photography. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
it's okay.
Yeah.
I love the quote that you included from Frederick Douglass, who said, "This picture-making power accompanies religion, supplying man with his God, peopling the silent continents of eternity with saints, angels, and fallen spirits, the blessed and the blasted, making manifest the invisible, and giving form and body to all that the soul can hope and fear in life and in death." And to me, this Douglass quote is not only beautiful, but it emphasizes a shift in how we memorialize and how we can almost use photographs as a way to lift up our dead and see them as sort of still living. What does Douglass's quote mean to you?
Douglass's quote means a lot. This is the first commentary that I've found that was very direct about sort of bringing photography into a discussion of religion, at least from the outside. We know that Frederick Douglass was very attentive to the power of the camera, right? He, as recent scholarship has demonstrated, he was the most photographed person in 19th century America. So he knew the power of the camera, the power of the photograph. And I think in this quote, he's really drawing his audience. This was not a published piece at first. It was a speech that he was giving. I think that he was really deliberate in articulating this idea of photographs being a kind of religious or spiritual instrument or tool that is a sentiment that's sort of floating around in the 19th century, and he really crystallizes that for me. So I'm not sure what it exactly means to me, other than that this is certainly a pivotal moment in the 1860s when photography is becoming or coming into its own as a kind of religious or spiritual grammar as much as a political or scientific or entertainment experience or concept.
Cool. So what did you learn about how families would incorporate their Bibles into like family portrait galleries? Is that something that happens as well?
It is. Yeah, it happens in the 1860s. It's pretty popular in both Protestant and Catholic editions of these family Bibles until the end of the 19th century. They're used for different purposes by different families. Some patterns that I saw emerge were essentially that similar to or echoing the registers, the family registers that have been part of family Bibles for generations at this point in time. There's this sort of chronicling of the family, although there's less of in the family registries. And what I mean by that are these sort of pages in family Bibles that would record the birth and death, sometimes the marriage dates of family members. In the family portrait galleries, there are images, these studio portraits, because at this point in time, very few people have cameras of their own. So they're going to studios or somebody's coming to their home and creating these portraits for them. They're including these portraits in their family Bible, but they're not often inscribing names or dates. It's just kind of this visual or this ghostly gallery for those of us who find these, a century or more later. There's not a lot of hard historical evidence about who these people were, but that, as I argue in the book, invokes the kind of intentional visual work that the images were doing. They weren't just supposed to be a historical record of these people. They were instead sort of lifted out of history by virtue of their photographs being included in these Bibles.
Old photographs are super interesting, and you can find them anywhere from like flea markets and libraries and basements and garages. But where did you dig up the majority of your personal collection?
I did a lot of flea marketing in and around Princeton, New Jersey, in the aughts and in the early 2010s. I used a lot of eBay to build my personal collection, but the sort of patterns and the archives, as I call them, that I'm attending to, come out of sort of a perusal of various archives at Princeton and in New York and in Philadelphia, and then also close reading of sort of trade journals and other kinds of publications that would indicate, what are people using? What are people interested in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and later?
A person that you write about in the book is a spirit photographer named William Howard Mumler. And this is a name that's going to be completely unknown to virtually all listeners, I would imagine. But this was a fascinating section of the book. Can you tell me about who he was and what his job was?
Yeah, so William Mumler, I could talk about him forever.
I know, I bet. It's so fascinating.
So I guess the down and dirty about William Mumler is that he starts as in his own sort of self-narration of his life. He's he's a jeweler by trade. He's in Boston, and on a Sunday morning, he's tinkering around with this sort of photography photographic equipment, and decides to take a self-portrait. So he sits in the chair. He prepares the plates. He exposes the plate. In the right order, and so he goes back and he later develops the plate, and he discovers that this is not only a picture of himself, but there's somebody else in the image. And so this is in 1862, and we can sort of think historically about what's going on in the U.S. at this point in time. But he begins to sort of market himself as a spiritualist, as a spirit photographer or a photographic medium. The language varies. Who will provide pictures, photographs of people who have died. And this becomes enormously attractive not only to spiritualist circles. Modern spiritualism had started a little bit more than a decade before this. And so there are spiritualist circles in Boston and New York and elsewhere. But he's very adept at not only marketing himself to that particular subculture, but also to the broader swaths of American society who are very deep in mourning. So parents who have lost their children, wives who have lost their spouses, children who have lost their parents, and so on and so forth. He promises that, all is not lost, right? You can have assurance of the continued existence of your beloved. And not without, not surprisingly, there's a lot of pushback to this, right? So he starts in Boston, but by the late 1860s, he's being pushed out of Boston. People begin to be very suspicious of his technique. So he finds himself in New York. He begins to make a name for himself in New York. And then again, this sort of controversy follows him. So in 1869, he goes on trial. It's not even a trial. He's arrested on fraud charges, and he finds himself in police court, where the prosecution is trying to determine, or to convince the judge, I should say, that this is indeed a crime and he needs to be prosecuted. So there's this sort of hearing in police court that goes on for a couple of weeks, or several weeks actually, in 1869, where quite literally you have evidence being brought in to try to determine whether or not these spirit photographs are real. Are they authentic? And the kinds of arguments that are brought into this hearing include scientific experts, folks from the Photographic Guild who are convinced that this is fraud, but they can't quite prove it, right? So they can't determine the exact method that he is creating these images. And then on his own side, his lawyer begins to sort of press at the very notion of religious authority, right? He begins to ask, well, what if this technology was around, in some of these Old Testament vignettes when God appears, or when spirits appear to the ancient Israelites, and so this sort of moment in time where quite literally in this sort of court of American law, you have this sort of contest between the authority of the camera and biblical authority that precedes, historically precedes some of our narratives about when this kind of conflict between science and religion occurs. So this is happening in 1869, and the William Mumler's pictures are at the heart of this story. I won't tell you; you'll have to read the book in order to learn what happens in the trial. But
I love it, and that is truly an amazing little piece of information about his lawyer's argument as well. I mean, just think about the implications of what he's saying there. It's really interesting. So photography is also hugely important because it allows people who live in the United States and around the world to sort of see the Holy Land, right?
Yeah, that's the claim, right?
Yeah, I know. So you read about this guy in the book. Another really interesting figure is Robert Edward Mather Bain, and who took an 1894 trip to Palestine. And so he is a St. Louisan, so that's pretty cool because I'm from St. Louis. You teach in St. Louis. And so Bain, a St. Louisan, is he responsible for sort of making the Bible visible to people around the world who can never go there for themselves?
I think that his editors would like to think that he is.
Yeah.
There have been instances of Americans and British Protestants and others, going to Jerusalem and going to various locations in what they call the Holy Land, well before the advent of photography, right? So There are panoramas of the Holy Land in the early 19th century. There are sort of magic lantern tours that precede this particular series in the 1890s. It had been a subject of stereography, photographic stereography from at least the late 1860s and early 1870s. So there was already a visual claim being made by photography and its champions that, you could visit the Holy Land without leaving the comfort of your home or your Sunday school room or wherever it was. What Bain does, and in fact, he's kind of an accident in history. He wasn't part of the original plan to go on this trip, but James Lee, the Methodist minister who had been recruited by the publisher to go on this tour after he had sort of visited the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and made some connections there and had articulated some interest in the power of photography. So James Lee, Methodist minister, initially proposes just to find a photographer on site. Right, the photography wasn't really what he was interested in, or at least it was sort of a secondary interest to him in terms of the professional status of what this volume would be. I don't know exactly how he came into contact with Bain, but Bain was a landscape photographer in St. Louis. And ended up as part of this trip.
That's really wild.
Yeah, and so what happens here? And I know we're on time here, but what happens here is that they go to the Holy Land, and these photographs are created as a portfolio, and then later they find themselves in the pages of the Bible. And so the argument there is that this is the first photographic Bible because it coincides with this new technology that enables these pictures to be printed. Not as a supplement to, but within the pages of the Bible.
I love that. Do you have a copy of that Bible by any chance?
I do. I have. It was published in multiple volumes, and I have a couple of them.
That is awesome. In the book, you paraphrase Ezra Pound as well, and I absolutely love this quote because you wrote, "We ought well to remember that there was a time when historians left blanks in their writings. There is much to behold in the communion of shadows, and there are many blanks in these pages for what we cannot know." What mysteries still exist for you on the topics discussed in the book?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that this quote resonated with me is because I was doing a kind of reception history that required, that was really built on particular readings of artifacts where there wasn't a lot of records of how ordinary people encountered them, right? So we have these physical archives that remain in on eBay or in antique shops or in flea markets, right? But very few people then really wrote about what these photographs meant to them, or how, if not sort of the meaning story, how they related to them. Sort of the affective history is also something that is a little bit more tenuous. And so what resonated here with me was that, there are always going to be blanks in historical writings, right? The mysteries that still exist for me are numerous. What I'm trying to sort of think through now is, how do we really know how to read or see these objects in the ways that they were received by, a parent in mourning in the 1850s, or a soldier at war in the 1860s. And I won't make any claims to having, really uncovered that in the way that I think it should be.
There's a lot of possible future research options within there as well. And I read a book recently called Being Muslim by a scholar named Sylvia Chan Malik, and she has a lot of really fantastic photographs as well. And I just am absolutely delighted by seeing what all of you fantastic professors are doing. It's just so cool. Can we talk about St. Louis for a little while?
Oh, please do. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so speaking of St. Louis, so I grew up there. I grew up out in the suburbs in Fenton, and am very familiar with the city. And you are doing some really, really cool projects that I admire in the city called Arch City Religion and Lived Religion in the Digital Age. Are these two different projects, or are they one?
They are. So Arch City Religion began as a teaching project when I started teaching at SLU in 2016. It was for undergrads to get out into the city to start thinking about religion as part of the experience of being in St. Louis, and not just something that happens, in theology classrooms or in these sort of formal religious spaces. And that grew into what is sort of the bigger research project of lived religion in the digital age, where some of the questions that came up in Arch City Religion are really animating that sort of bigger research project.
Very cool. And I saw that one of my friends, soon to be Dr. Chris Babbitts from the University of Texas, is going to be joining Lived Religion in the Digital Age as well, coming up in the future. So you have been photographing, documenting many religious sites in St. Louis for Arch City Religion and Lived Religion in the Digital Age. So when you leave your office at SLU and travel like several blocks in any direction, what do you find? Tell me about religion in St. Louis.
Right. I mean, Midtown St. Louis is a great example of the kinds of religion that it's sort of right under our noses oftentimes that we don't always see. So walking out from my office, there's a mosque. It's within the sort of the parameters of the campus, but it's a distinct it's not owned by SLU. There's an International Society of Krishna Consciousness less than a block away. College Church is one of the older Catholic churches in St. Louis, the first English-speaking church, Catholic church in St. Louis. A little bit on the same street that my office is on, there's a Masonic temple and a Masonic cathedral. A block behind that, there's an abandoned and burnt out stone church that started as an immigrant Protestant church in the 1800s, I think around 1870, that became sort of that a number of different denominations later claimed. There are Lutheran churches, more Catholic churches. Central Baptist Church is not too far away, a large and very significant historically Black Protestant church. A Third Baptist Church is just a few blocks away as well. So the kind of formal religious spaces that we might expect in a mapping of religion. We also want to draw attention to places like the Fox Theater, which is not too far from campus, and a site, maybe an unlikely site of religion in the city. We're not too far from the Missouri Botanical Garden. Henry Shaw sort of started this out of his own personal interest in botany in the late 19th century. And this is also a place where we can think about religion in the city for a variety of reasons. The St. Louis Arch is not too far from campus either. In fact, you can see it from almost anywhere on campus. I mean, these are other kinds of spaces where we can think about religion in and religion of the city. And I guess maybe the last example I'll give you, I mean, in addition to the plethora of religious spaces on a Jesuit campus, a number of students have begun to think sort of intentionally about the school's mascot, the Billiken, as being sort of part of this sort of bigger history of religion in St. Louis in ways that they hadn't thought about.
Oh, that is super interesting. And you made a website, which I've been perusing regularly in recent days, archcityreligion.org, and you have this neighborhood breakdown of the city. And so tell me a little bit about some of the interesting things you've learned about religion based on neighborhood breakdown. Like, what does geography matter to religion in the city?
Right, like I think like many other American cities that date back to really the founding of the Republic, and that have experienced multiple waves of migration. St. Louis is still very much a city of neighborhoods. And so it's one thing to talk about sort of arch city religion as sort of this big portrait of a very diverse landscape. But there's also opportunities to drill into the particular profiles of individual neighborhoods. So many of my students who come from St. Louis can very easily identify different neighborhoods. You've got Soulard downtown, a little bit south of downtown, that's sort of the French Catholic heritage center. Dogtown is more Irish Catholic. The Hill is Italian. Bevo Mill is now sort of the epicenter of refugee Bosnian community. So there are different ways of thinking about religion and neighborhoods in that sense. But another way of thinking about religion and neighborhoods that a number of students, and I should just pause and give a huge shout out to students at SLU for really sort of playing this game with me. I mean, I'm really asking them to do a lot for undergrads to go out and to really think very intentionally and deliberately about what religion is outside of the definitions that are most familiar to them. And so a lot of the work on that site, the Arch City Religion site, is really their work. And so I don't want to take credit for what they're doing.
It's absolutely wonderful. And the website, which, I mean, obviously huge shout out to your students as well. I'm amazed at what students are capable of doing whenever we put trust in them to make something awesome happen. Like my students, whenever I lift them up, like, and challenge them, like they come through every time.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's the best part of the job.
Yeah, and the website features fantastic photo tours of sites and interviews with prominent St. Louis religious leaders who have been some of your favorite new friendships that you've developed simply by expressing interest in the local St. Louis religious community.
It's such a great question, and I confess that when you ask this, I haven't thought of this before. But friendships, or at least neighborliness, is really what we should be striving for here. And that's, part of what we, in the Lived Religion in the Digital Age project, is sort of one of our intents here, is to really develop these ongoing partnerships and collaborations in order to be better neighbors. I've had, a great time getting to know Maharat Rory Picker-Nice. A number of students have interviewed her. She has only been in St. Louis for about 5 or 6 years, but has sort of become a defining feature, if you will, of the local Jewish population and leadership. I mean, there's so many other people that sort of have made this possible. Maybe even on campus, working with digital humanities and with colleagues in the Department of Theological Studies, this is truly a collaborative exercise, both on campus and in the community.
So I live in Buffalo, and Buffalo and St. Louis have so much in common. Like if I walk around downtown Buffalo and downtown St. Louis, oftentimes I feel like I'm in the same place in a lot of ways. This is a project that seems like it could be replicated in most any major city. Like I feel like I could start a website. Nickel City is the nickname of Buffalo. So nickelcityreligion.org. And I feel like I could start that tomorrow and go out and do a project like this. Have you inspired others to follow your lead on Arch City and put it into practice in their towns at all?
I don't know about inspiring, but I think we certainly want to help model this kind of work for folks who, for educators, for others who are interested in creating spaces to really think about religion, lived religion in their cities. We've had the great fortune of working with some faculty at the University of Pittsburgh who are also sort of starting a project on religion in Pittsburgh. Rachel Cranston is sort of spearheading that project. And as part of Lived Religion in the Digital Age, we've been fortunate to have sort of received some funding to really put some, put our backs into this work of of not sponsoring but facilitating some of these projects in other places through fellowships, through teaching fellowships, through research fellowships. A lot of people around the country are really interested in the local, and we want to be part of that bigger conversation.
What are some of your next goals in scholarship and in your projects and teaching? What are you working on?
What are we working on right now? Well, for in the foreseeable future, we're putting together a symposium for the fall that will really kick off this sort of national. We hope will kick off. It's kind of ambitious to say this right now, but it will help to sort of kick off this sort of national conversation around the questions that we're asking in the project. So that we're looking forward to that. As you mentioned earlier, we've got some amazing fellows who are just now starting to work with us, and we're thrilled to be learning from them as they do their research and develop coursework and different pedagogical tools over the next year. We'll do more fellowships next year and then the year after as well. So we really are looking forward to these collaborations both locally and nationally. For me, my research is really sort of bound up with this initiative right now, but I'm working on a cultural history of religion in St. Louis that I hope will sort of help me to ground my my research in a way that will be useful to others.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Rachel Lindsey, where can people find you if they want to follow your work and know more? I know you got some websites and some social media.
Yeah, so if you want to stay in touch with the Lived Religion Project, you can follow us on Twitter at Lived Religion. The website for that is religioninplace.org. And track me down at AAR or anywhere else. I'd love to talk with you about this.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Rachel Lindsey, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's been a delight to talk about your projects and your book, Communion of Shadows. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. This has been great.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.